Welcome to Outside Views. Today we continue our exploration of what a UK application for EU membership would actually involve. And this is not a rejoin. There is no automatic way back. There's only the accession process. And as we have discussed before, this process is the same for every country that applies. Today we are covering one of the most important and complex areas of EU membership, that's justice, freedom, and security. And this chapter is at the heart of the EU's efforts to maintain a secure, fair, and cooperative legal framework across its member states. For the UK, this chapter would be a significant hurdle in any attempt to rejoin the European Union, or join again, to better say. Since Brexit, the UK has diverged substantially from EU policies in this area. Realigning with EU standards would not only require legal reforms, but also a fundamental shift in the UK's approach to border control, asylum policy, law enforcement cooperation, and the protection of citizens' rights. So what does this chapter actually cover? The EU's justice, freedom, and security policies are designed to ensure a high level of safety and legal cooperation between member states. This includes areas such as border control, visas, external migration, asylum, police cooperation, the fight against organized crime and terrorism, drug control policies, customs cooperation, and judicial cooperation in both criminal and civil matters. All of these areas require strong administrative structures and law enforcement bodies that operate efficiently and with full adherence to EU standards. One of the most detailed and important aspects of this chapter is the Schengen Acquis. The Schengen Agreement eliminates internal border controls between participating states, creating a zone of free movement. While new EU members do not automatically join Schengen upon accession, they are required to prepare for eventual membership by aligning their border management systems with EU standards. And this is not the opt-out old members have. This means that if the UK were to reapply for EU membership, it would have to implement major changes in its border control policies, which have been completely redesigned post-Brexit. Currently, the UK operates under its own immigration system, which prioritizes national control over who enters the country. Post-Brexit policies have focused on restricting free movement, tightening visa requirements, and creating barriers for EU citizens that previously did not exist. Joining the EU again would require a complete reversal of these policies. Freedom of movement would have to be reinstated, and the UK's immigration system would need to align with EU laws. Additionally, cooperation with EU border agencies such as Frontex would need to be re-established. And this would require legislative changes and a complete overhaul of the UK's post-Brexit border enforcement mechanisms. Another major issue is asylum and refugee policy. The EU has a common asylum system that sets out strict rules on how asylum seekers must be processed and treated. And now we are getting GEAS, that's an additional system. But the UK has significantly diverged from EU standards in this area since Brexit already, and policies such as offshore asylum processing and strict deportation measures would likely be considered incompatible with EU human rights obligations. Joining the EU again would mean reintroducing EU asylum rules, ensuring fair processing of asylum applications, and abandoning policies that violate international human rights standards. Police and law enforcement cooperation is another critical area covered by this chapter. Before Brexit, the UK was a member of Europol and Eurojust, two key EU agencies that facilitate police cooperation and criminal investigations across borders. The UK also had access to the Schengen Information System, which allowed for real-time sharing of criminal intelligence between law enforcement agencies across Europe. Since leaving the EU, the UK has lost access to these tools, making cross-border law enforcement significantly more difficult. To join the EU again, the UK would have to fully reintegrate into these systems, re-establishing full cooperation with Europol, Eurojust, and other EU security mechanisms. The fight against organized crime and terrorism is another area where the UK would need to align with EU policies. The EU has strict measures for countering human trafficking, drug smuggling and financial crime, including money laundering and terrorist financing. Post-Brexit, the UK has implemented its own approach, which differs quite a lot from EU standards in certain respects. Reapplying for EU membership would require the UK to harmonise its policies with EU directives and fully cooperate with EU-wide security operations. And customs cooperation is also a key element of this chapter. The EU's customs policies ensure that goods entering and leaving the EU meet security standards and are properly monitored. Brexit led to significant disruptions in customs procedures, particularly at UK-EU borders. If the UK were to reapply for membership, it would need to fully reintegrate into the EU's customs system, restoring pre-Brexit trade and security protocols. Judicial cooperation in civil and criminal matters is another fundamental requirement. EU member states work together to ensure that legal judgments and enforcement measures are recognized across borders. Before Brexit, the UK was part of the European arrest warrant system, which allowed for the fast-track extradition of criminals between EU countries. The UK also participated in EU mechanisms that ensure mutual recognition of court rulings. Since Brexit, these arrangements have been replaced with weaker bilateral agreements. Joining the EU again would require the UK to fully reinstate judicial cooperation, bringing its legal system back in line with EU standards. And this brings us to the broader question of EU accession. Joining the EU again is not a simple return, it's an entirely new application process. And that process is governed by the so-called Copenhagen criteria. And these criteria set the fundamental requirements for any country seeking EU membership. A candidate country must demonstrate stable institutions guaranteeing democracy, the rule of law, human rights, and protections for minorities. And it must have a functioning market economy capable of handling the competitive pressures of the EU. And it must show the ability to adopt and enforce the full body of EU law, including justice, freedom, and security policies. Many people think of negotiations as two sides bargaining over terms, but EU accession is not that. It is a process of compliance. The EU does not lower its standards for new members. It's the applicant that must meet those standards. And the UK, if it were to reapply ever, would not receive special treatment. It would go through the same 35-chapter process as any other applicant. Justice, freedom and security is just one of these chapters. Failure to comply means failure to progress in the accession process. And this is why this process is long and rigorous. There are no shortcuts, only full compliance. Joining the EU again would mean fully aligning with EU border policies with security standards, judicial cooperation mechanisms, and fundamental rights protections. And of course, as I said a lot of times, there would be no opt-outs, no exceptions, no cherry-picking. Only the process. And given the UK's current political climate, achieving compliance with this chapter could be one of the most challenging hurdles in the entire accession process. It would require political will, it would require legislative reform and a commitment to European values that has been absent in much of the UK's post-Brexit governance. So thank you for watching Outside Views, and if you found this analysis insightful, don't forget to like and subscribe. And of course, let me know in the comments what you think about this aspect of a potential UK application. See you in the next video, and the next video is already right here in the end screen.